All right. Good evening, everyone. It is 7 o'clock, and welcome to Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship for 2/02/23. And we're glad to have you in the new year. Tonight we have with us Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, and he is going to be speaking tonight on his experience in the ER. His talk is entitled Spiritual Frontiers in the ER, One Physician's Journey. We are really blessed and excited to have Dr. Jeff with us tonight. Thank you for joining us. And if you're here for the first time, well, welcome. So glad that you found us. And if you've been with us before, welcome back to the SFF community. I'm Smith Prim. I'm the co-chairman for Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship, along with Catherine Smart. Catherine Smart is also our writer and our editor, and she's here tonight, as well as Kim Kasdorf. He is our media director. He's with us tonight. And Eileen Jenna is also with us. She is our program coordinator. And just wanted to take a moment and let you know that SFF is here for you. We are an all volunteer-run organization, and we're here to help you develop and enhance your spiritual, mystical, and metaphysical awareness and consciousness. We do that by sponsoring programs like the one tonight. It's designed to facilitate your personal growth and development and a holistic and spiritual approach to health and living. Want to let everyone also know that tonight's program is being recorded. So if you do not want to be recorded, you can take a moment and just disable or turn off your video. And did someone say they could not hear? Yes? No? All right, I'll continue. So before I introduce tonight's speaker, we usually take a moment just to clear our minds and get our thoughts together to focus on the speaker. If you could take just a moment to close your eyes and take 3 breaths with me. On our first breath, we'll breathe in and we'll breathe out any tensions or distractions that are left over from our day. And on our second breath, let's take it in and breathe in love and light and relaxation and release. And on our third breath, more love and light in. And with one last exhale. And welcome back. And so tonight, I am so honored to introduce Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll. Tonight, Jeff will take us on a spiritual journey with him, empowering us to better understand our spiritual connections. From his perspective, as a Western trained physician and a scientist with his many profound spiritual experiences, he offers participants a pathway to seeing science and spirit as complementary, not contradictory. And in his words, as I visit with people, I discern their gifts and I help them find their spiritual center. Dr. Jeff is a medical doctor. He had 25 years of experience in the emergency room. So he's got a lot of stories that he can share with us tonight. And he's written and published in several fields, including medical science, medical administration, leadership, theology, ancient scripture, biography, fiction, and there's one children's literature book called Not Yet. In that memoir, he describes and highlights from his 25 years in the emergency department and walks readers through a series of experiences that open a window into the spiritual world. So I'm looking forward also to the follow-up discussion, and he's offered, as he is presenting tonight, if you have a question, to raise your hand, and we'll see if we can identify you and let you interact a little bit. But we really want to save the majority of our question and answer for after his presentation. So he will present for up until about 8:20 or 8:25. We'll take a short break, and that'll be a social break tonight with Eileen Jenna. So we'll look forward to that too. That's going to give us all a chance to talk with each other. And then we'll come back and do some question and answer. So now, please sit back and enjoy our presentation tonight with Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll. Dr. Jeff?
Oh, thank you so much for that generous introduction. I appreciate that. It's so good to be with all of you. I look forward to sharing some of my experiences, and I look forward to the question and answer session because that's often when the best stuff comes out, when people get engaged and we have a back and forth conversation. So I'm looking forward to that as well. But just let me introduce myself a little bit here. Let me start with an experience I had in the emergency department, and then I'll work backwards and give you some context for how that happened. I was in the emergency department one evening working, getting near the end of my shift. Nothing unusual had happened. And we got a radio call about a patient that was being flown in from 100, 150 miles away, who had been involved in a bad car crash. And in the crash, his 14-month-old son had died, and his wife of 10 years had passed at the scene. And his 7-year-old son was very minimally injured. And the patient that was being flown to us was severely injured. He had bad chest and abdominal injuries. He had bad injuries to his extremities. He did not have a head injury. He was taken to a local hospital where he was stabilized to the extent possible, and then flown to our level 1 trauma center. A level 1 trauma center is the highest acuity patients. So we get patients flown in from all over our state and neighboring states with horrible critical illnesses and life-threatening injuries. So there was another emergency physician in the department and other care providers there. I wasn't planning on taking care of this inbound patient. I was just going about my tasks and getting near the end of my day. And then this nurse who knew me well, she was a relatively new nurse, and somehow she had pried out of me that I had some spiritual experiences in the emergency department, for lack of a better word. I had experiences that science couldn't explain, and neither could I really. And we were visiting very privately one day, and she proceeded to tell me about some of her experiences that she had that just literally, honestly moved me to tears, that she had had these profound experiences. And so she knew this about me. And she came and she grabbed me on the arm. She said, "You have to come down to the trauma room." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Because she's there." I said, "Who's there? What are you talking about?" She said, "His wife, she's there. You have to come." And then because of our relationship, I understood what she was talking about. So I went with her down to the trauma room. And mind you, there was, as I said, another physician in there and the whole trauma team taking care of this man. He was unconscious on the gurney, and he was surrounded by a bunch of professionals and care providers taking care of him. And I had absolutely no medical responsibility for his care. But when I walked into the trauma room and saw him motionless on the gurney with all these people around him, I also saw his wife standing in the air above the gurney. His wife, whose body was still at the scene of the accident. And I'd never met either of them before, but I knew her. I knew who she was immediately, instantaneously. I knew why she was there. And the whole room, for me, kind of slowed down and got quiet. Everybody was still doing their tasks, getting orders and carrying out orders and talking about their various assignments. But for me, it was as if somebody turned the volume down on the television set and everything got quiet. And she communicated to me her profound gratitude for the care that her husband was receiving. And the nurse who came and got me by the arm and dragged me down there was having the same experience. So I walked over to the gurney and everybody else was doing their tasks. I was kind of inconspicuous, frankly. I think I was the department chair at the time and nobody bothered to notice me. I was in scrubs and stuff like everybody else. But I just walked over and I touched his foot. I checked the pulse in his foot because he had a bad leg injury. And there's a narrow window of opportunity to repair an injury to the main artery that goes behind the knee if you hope to save the leg after certain kinds of injuries. And I remember checking the pulse in his foot and looking at him and thinking, oh, he's going to lose the leg. I might have even said it out loud. I don't remember. But as I looked down at him on the gurney, I could still see his wife standing in the air behind me because I could see in all directions at the same time. And I had a knowledge of that he would live. I knew he'd lose his leg. I understood that he and this woman were husband and wife. And it was as if everything in my life just immediately, the priorities all shuffled and everything that was important floated up to the top. And most of what we spend most of our time doing is not anything on the important list, unfortunately. We soon sent this man, who I later learned was also named Jeff, off to either the operating room or the ICU. And I went over and took off my shoe covers and my gown and walked out into the department, finished up my shift and went home. I never expected to see him again. I wrote in my journal, I have a journal I've kept daily for over 40 years. And that night in my journal, I wrote something to the effect about, I had a profound experience in the emergency department. And that was about all I wrote. And part of the reason I wrote so little is because I'm not a talkative guy. And back then I was still handwriting my journal, and I, was pretty brief most of the time. And the other reason is because I had those experiences before. I'd had many profound experiences. But about a month later, I'm in the emergency department. The same nurse comes and starts tugging on my arm. And I kind of brushed her off. I said, "Go away. I don't like it when you tug on my arm." But she was persistent, like all good nurses. She insisted that we go see this other Jeff and tell him about the experience we'd had, because she'd experienced it too. And I said, "Listen, if you want to go talk to a total stranger about your most spiritual experiences, go be my guest, but I don't feel any obligation to do so." But she drugged me kicking and screaming up to his hospital room. And this was about a month after the accident. He'd had several surgeries by then. He'd had his leg amputated. But he was awake, he was conscious and lucid, and we had a conversation. I didn't remember this until Jeff told me this 20 years later. He said, "Yeah, you didn't really talk much. You mostly leaned against the wall and nodded once in a while," which I thought, yeah, that's probably an accurate recollection. That sounds like me. And the nurse, whom I think in my book I call her Rachel, pulled up a chair, sat down at the side of the gurney, and proceeded to tell him about this profound spiritual experience we'd had with his deceased wife in the trauma room. And Jeff got quite emotional about it. And he felt validated enough and safe enough talking to us that he opened up and shared with us at that time that while his body was still physically trapped in the car, he'd left his body and risen up above the scene of the accident and met his deceased wife in this profound, indescribable light. And she had told him, "You have to go back and raise our other son." And he had gone back to his body. So that was our conversation the first day that we communicated with one another verbally. He was unconscious the first. And he later told me he grew up in rural Utah. So did I. We were in separate counties, but close by, but we concluded we'd never met each other, but we might've been on the football field at the same time when our high schools played sports. And he had ridden broncs in rodeos, and I was a bull rider in rodeo when I was in high school. So we had a lot in common. And he later told me 20 years later, he said, "Yeah, you had on blue jeans and you had a belt buckle with a bull rider on it and cowboy boots. And I thought, oh, maybe I can trust this guy. So that was something that kind of fed our early relationship. I gave him my phone number before I left that day. This is when cell phones were still, not everybody had a cell phone. Most doctors did because of the work we did, but he recognized that it was a significant thing that I had given him my mobile number and invited him to call me. And he and I are still friends today. Next month will be 26 years since his accident, and we're still good friends today. Well, he didn't talk about his experience for about 10 years, and then he wrote a book and shared his experience widely. And he invited me to speak with him a few times, and for another 10 years, I declined. And then one day, after I stopped seeing patients in the emergency department, about 6 months later, I woke up one day and I just somehow knew it was okay to talk about it. And that's when I started to share and speak about some of my experiences. And within 6 months or so, I'd written my book, my memoir. It's titled Not Yet. And I had a bag full of books, literally. And I was sitting in the airport getting ready to fly to Boston, Massachusetts, to speak for the first time about my experiences in the emergency department. And I'd spoken publicly a lot about other things. I had spoken on medical subjects and history and all kinds of things, but not about seeing dead people. And so Jeff set up our first speaking engagement together in Salem, Massachusetts. I said, "You got to be kidding me. I remained silent for 25 years and you set up my first speaking engagement in Salem, Massachusetts?" He said, "Yeah, it'll be great. We'll have fun." So I'm sitting in the airport waiting to fly to Boston, and this young couple comes up and sits down next to me. And they start asking me the usual airport questions like, "Where are you going? What are you doing?" And when they got to the "what are you going to be speaking about" question, and I told them, this woman's whole countenance, her whole expression changed. She got very serious and she said, "My grandfather just died and he's come to me a couple of times." And my initial thought was, why would you share something so intimate with a total stranger? Which was an ironic thought considering where I was going and what I was going to be doing. But then I realized, oh, I'm a safe space. She knows I'll believe her. And she told me a bunch of stuff. It was wonderful. We had a wonderful conversation. She took one of my books and went and got on her plane. I went and got on my plane. I had estimated, but by that point in my career, I had seen in excess of 60,000 patients. And on the plane to Boston, a voice spoke to me and said, "You will help more people with this book than you helped as a physician in the emergency department." And that just kind of reset my whole framework for the next chapter of my life. So when I started talking about these things, people started asking me questions I'd never contemplated before. Like, how did this happen for you? When did this start for you? What made this happen in your life? And I had no answer. I was clueless. And then I started thinking about it and I put a little more thought into it. And over time, I realized it all started shortly after my brother died in a farm accident. I had an older brother. He was a few years older than I. Just a month before my 12th birthday, he was involved in a farm accident. I loved my brother. I trusted him. I believed everything he told me through my young formative years until I was about 10 years old, maybe 11. And he proceeded one day to tell me about sex. And I said, "No way." And he said, we didn't talk about sex anymore after that. But other than that, I believed everything he ever told me. And then all of a sudden he was gone. And I didn't think it really had a significant psychological impact on me. I thought I got through it unscathed. I missed him. I loved him, but he was gone and life went on. And that's kind of how I viewed it. And then 20 years after my brother died, he came to me one day and he said, "You have to go talk to our mother. There's things she's never told you about my death," which you can imagine got my attention. So I called up my mother. We found a day that worked well for both of us. And I went and sat down with her on a beautiful sunny day. And she told me for the very first time that day, she said, "I always knew where you were in the house before Stan died because I could hear you singing. When your brother died, you stopped singing." And that was the first time I realized that his departure had had a major impact on me. It had changed me. It had written on my soul and made me a different person. And then I started thinking about, and thankfully I had this journal. I didn't start the journal till I was 19, so I didn't have a lot of my early years in it. But in some of my entries after I was 19, I talked about some of my experiences when I was younger. And on one occasion, I talked about wrecking the car. I remembered wrecking the car, but I didn't remember a lot of the other details. I was driving a Volkswagen Bug way too fast after dark on a narrow, windy country road with two friends in the car. And sure as the hell, none of us were wearing a seatbelt. Nobody wore a seatbelt back then, but they were for decoration. And I heard a voice speak to me and said, "You need to slow down." And the voice just wrapped itself around my soul and it like sunk in and became part of me. And I knew I had to slow down. I slowed down. And looking back later, I couldn't understand why, because I was in such a rebellious part of my life. I was drinking and smoking and doing other things I didn't tell my mother about. And I would not have listened to my parents or any kind of an authority figure, not law enforcement, anything like that. I've joked that if God had been sitting in the seat next to me, I wouldn't have listened to him. But the voice that spoke to me was so compelling. And I later understood it was my brother. It was the only voice I would have listened to was my brother's voice. It was the only voice I trusted. We went around the corner. We hit a Cadillac head on. There was a lot of damage, but nobody was injured. I think I would have died that night if it hadn't been for that voice that spoke to me. And so fast forward a few years, I'm having enough of these experiences. I'm 19 years old. I approached a woman who was a few years older than me that I trusted, that I respected. And I grew up in a traditional, kind of strict religious Christian home. And I approached this woman with the only vocabulary available to me at that time in my life. And without giving her any context whatsoever for my question, I said, "Does God ever speak to you in sentences?" And she just looked at me and she kind of pointed her finger at me with this serious expression. She said, "Don't ever doubt that." That was all she said, which proved to be good advice. Doubt is often our biggest obstacle to being connected, to feeling, experiencing, communicating with our deceased loved ones, with our higher self, with the divine, with spirit. All of us use different words. We have a different vocabulary, but doubt is such an impediment to what we want to be and where we want to go. It's a good thing to release. Let go of doubt. So as the years went by, I had more and more of these kind of experiences, and I'd get more and more messages, more clear messages, and then sometimes I started to see the messenger. And sometimes I knew who the messenger was, and sometimes I didn't. And I learned by over the years, if I didn't know the messenger, sometimes it was good to ask the simple question, "Who are you?" And I didn't always get an answer, but when I did get an answer, it was like, "Oh, of course, that makes perfect sense now." You know, of course, that's who you'd be. And sometimes I would ask, "What is your message?" If they didn't offer it clearly and and uninvited. I'd say, do you have a message for me? Do you have an errand for me? What do you want me to do? And the reason I did this was because I learned over time that messengers or guides or angels, loved ones, whoever they are, they're so respectful that this is our life, not theirs. And they respect our choice and our agency so much that sometimes they won't deliver their message unless you invite them to do so, because they don't want to infringe upon your agency. And so I learned that sometimes if things weren't clear, to ask, who are you and what do you want me to do? And that proved very valuable at times. I remember one time, many years later, a being came to me and gave me this very clear message and said, go tell my brother. Well, they told me the name. They said, go tell so-and-so. And I said, well, why don't you just go deliver that message yourself? And he said, oh, he won't receive it from me. So I didn't even know my friend had a deceased brother. I met up with him a couple days later and I said, hey, do you have any siblings? And he said, yeah. And he started rattling off the names of his siblings, including his brother who had died of pancreatic cancer. And I said, you have a dead brother? And he goes, yeah. Well, that gave me one little modicum of confidence in my experience, but I was still cautious. I still had trepidation about it. And so I kind of very, in a roundabout way, I said, I had this interesting experience and it's like I got this message. I felt like maybe it was for you. And I shared the message and he just looked at me and immediately he said, oh, that's my brother. I said, really? And he goes, yeah. I said, well, why didn't he come give the message to you? And he said, oh, I wouldn't have received it from him. So they come to us at different times and for different reasons. Sometimes they're coming to give us help and sometimes they're coming to ask us for help. And the reason it flows for me, I think, the reason it fits for me, and I realize that this is just my paradigm, that everybody else might feel very differently about it. But the reason, the way it works in my mind is this. We are all divine beings of infinite, eternal, unchanging worth. We came from a divine place. We have divine progenitors. We're on a divine path to a divine destiny. And all of us are at different points along that path. And some of us haven't been born yet, but we come along to help those that are out ahead of us on the path because we have some knowledge or skill or ability to help them. And some of us are here on the mortal path, this little segment that's immortality. And we try to help one another. And some of us have already died. And in the next life, we're still an existent being. We're still this eternal being. We still have a consciousness and awareness. And I believe that we have sociality with loved ones. And because we have all that experience, I think sometimes we come back and help somebody that's still here in this life. We give them some encouragement. We give them their next step. We try to pick them up when they're down. And we're all just helping one another. We're all exactly the same. We're just on a continuum at different stages along the way. And for me, when I understand it that way, then I realize, wait a minute, my mortal experience being in this physical realm is part of my divine path. And if it's part of my divine path, then being mortal does not make me less divine. And the reason that's so important came to me when I was seeing a patient in the emergency department one day. It was in the winter. It was, I think, in November. It was cold and snowy and wet outside. I live in Salt Lake City in Utah, so we get pretty good winters. Yesterday, I think my mother said below the house where I grew up, and they have a bunch of snow on the ground. So I went into this hospital room, and there was this gentleman. He was reclining back on the gurney. He was wearing some tattered, soiled clothing. He had long, shaggy hair and an unkempt beard. He struggled with substance use. and his feet were in bad shape because he had holes in his shoes and holes in his socks, and he'd been out walking around in wet, cold socks and shoes for a long time. I don't think we even spoke much because we both knew what needed to be done. I grabbed a wash basin and I filled it with some warm water, squirted some soap in it, and grabbed a wash rag. And I sat down at the foot of the gurney. I took off his shoes. I removed the threads of what was left of his socks, and I proceeded to wash his feet. And something profound happened. Everything that was physical or mortal or temporal was drawn aside. A veil, if you will, was drawn back, and I saw his soul. And I was in the presence of the divine. And I experienced it. And I'm not using hyperbole. I understood I was in the presence of the divine. I'd gone into the room thinking I was there to help him. And I later realized he'd come to minister to me. He was teaching me who I was by showing me who he was. He was the antithesis of everything the world defines as success. And yet I saw his divinity. And I viewed every soul differently since that day, because I finally realized that whether you're sitting in the pews at church or in the gutter, the person next to you is always God, because that's who you are too. And when we understand that, then we can start treating each other the way that we should, the way we deserve to be treated. And we don't just treat other people better, but we learn to treat ourselves better. We learn to accept and love ourselves. I was in meditation one day, struggling with something that I perceived to be a great weakness of mine, a moral failing that I had been working on for decades, and I didn't feel like I was getting any better at it. And I was frustrated. And a voice spoke to me and said, "You're here to love yourself as you are." And I thought, no way, that contradicts everything I've been taught all my life. That sounds like a rationalization. That must be my voice talking. And then I was led to some passages of ancient texts. And mind you, I've read a lot of ancient texts. I've studied the Bhagavad Gita of the Hindus. I've studied the Quran of the Muslims. I learned Hebrew to study the Torah. I tried learning some Greek to study the New Testament, but I didn't get very far with the Greek. I've studied a lot of texts, ancient and modern, and when I come to the texts in the Torah and in the Christian New Testament and talk about loving your neighbor as yourself, the fundamental part of that, the thing that you have to do first is to love yourself. And that day that I was in meditation, when a voice or spirit spoke to me and said, your job's to love yourself as you are, I was led to those scriptures, those verses. And a voice spoke to me and said, the only way you can honor this injunction today is to love yourself as you are. That's the only you that exists today. If you want to love next week's version of you next week, that's fine. And if there's a better version of you next year, you can love that person then. But today, to honor the invitation to love yourself, the only way you can do it today is to love yourself as you are. And that changed me. That changed my perspective on so many things, because we get it so hammered into our head with our culture and our religious traditions, even in the business world, get all caught up in what we're becoming and the things we need to do to be something better, to be something more, and that we're the sum total of our actions. And it's not about being, it's not about what you are, it's always about what you're becoming. And I got a different perspective on that. You have to balance what you're becoming with what you're being, because you only ever live in the present. You can remember the past and learn from it. And you can anticipate the future and look forward to it or prepare for it. But you can only ever experience anything in the now. You will only ever experience the divine in the present. And so some of these experiences helped me learn that. I was logging onto the computer one day to start a shift, and I became aware of a presence over my shoulder. I'd had enough experience by then that I knew who it was intuitively. It was the soul of the woman whose physical body was in the next room, and a team of physicians and other professionals were trying to resuscitate her and bring her back to life. She was receiving chest compressions, CPR. She had a tube in her throat. She was intubated. She was unconscious. She couldn't speak. And here she was standing over my shoulder asking me for help. So I stopped what I was doing. I walked around the corner into the room. It was kind of like that experience I had with Jeff Olson, in that there was already a doctor in there in charge of everything and running the resuscitation. I didn't have any responsibility for the woman's care, and nobody even noticed me in the room because I was wearing the same things I wore to ER every day. And it wasn't uncommon for an extraneous person to come into a room to observe what's going on when you have a critical patient or something like that. And there was people crowded all around the gurney, except at one place near her lower leg. And I just walked over and nonchalantly, inconspicuously rested my hand on her leg, because I had learned by then that touch is so important. The moment I touched her leg, she asked me if she could leave. Mentally, telepathically, mind you, she asked me. She was unconscious with a tube in her throat, receiving chest compressions. But she communicated to my soul if she asked if she could leave. And I thought, why would you ask me that? Why would you think I know the answer to that question? But as I thought that, the words came to me from some divine place. And I knew what to communicate back to her, silently again, mind you. Nobody else in the room was aware of what was going on. And I communicated back to her. I said, if you think it's the right time to go and you feel that that's the right thing for you to do, I think it's probably okay. And the moment I communicated that to her, she rose up out of her body and she stood in the air above the gurney. And she looked to be about half the age of the body she'd just come out of. She looked perfect, if you will. If there was a perfect human form, that was accentuated by glory and love and light, that's what she was. That's how she felt. And mind you, when you have these experiences, it's so much more about what you feel and what you know than what you hear and what you see. Because spirit communicates through what we feel and what we know. And she thanked me for what I'd done, which to me seemed like nothing. And then she left. And as I turned around to walk out of the room, I heard the physician in charge pronounce her time of death in military time. And I remember thinking, yeah, I know, I saw her leave. And then I went out and I logged onto the computer, and that's how my day began. There's something profound about being around people as they're transitioning, both into this life and out. Because I was around a lot of people during my emergency department career. I was around a lot of people that came into this life as well, that were born. And I had equally spiritual experiences. I think of it this way. Imagine yourself, you're in a big room, and the light's not really bright. It's not dark. You can see around, but it's not really bright. And there's a bunch of people in this room milling around. And over on one side of the room, there's this big, dark, heavy curtain. And every once in a while, somebody back the curtain and a person enters the room. And while the curtain's drawn open, there's this bright, beautiful light, this glory that invades the space. And you get to experience it until the curtain closes again. And on the other side of the room, there's another similar curtain. And every once in a while, somebody draws it back and a soul leaves the room. And if you're standing over there by the curtain and it's drawn open far enough, you might see inside. You might experience some of that glory as it splashes back onto you. And if you see far enough in there, you might see somebody you recognize. And then the curtain closes. And that's kind of how I imagine this life. Is we're going around, we have some light, we have some understanding, we have some knowledge, but it's incomplete, it's imperfect. We're getting along okay, but every once in a while, something life-changing happens and we get to experience a bit of that brilliant light and glory when somebody shows up or when they leave. And the blessing for me in the emergency department was that I got to experience that all the time. I saw souls transition, not daily, but at least a couple times a week. And I remember sometimes when somebody would leave, when they'd pass, sometimes the crew would disperse and call housekeeping to come clean the room. They'd go on to their next patients, and that was that. And I learned that if I just hung back for literally 15, 20, 30 seconds, just quietly standing, waiting, not being conspicuous. Nobody else knew what I was doing, but I would just wait there and I would just kind of get centered and quiet. And I'd acknowledge that this was a soul, this was a human being that had passed through this life and had now graduated onto a new existence. And just that moment of awareness seemed to open a portal, if you will. They almost always came back and thanked me for just being aware, for just acknowledging them at this very profound time. I really believe, and maybe when we get to the Q&A, others can comment on this. I'd love to know what others think about this, but I really think that our grief, our warped perspective about life, about birth and death and life and where we're going, our grief gets so overwhelming that we miss the most profoundly spiritual experiences of our lives. When we're sitting with a loved one when they pass, sometimes we're so overwhelmed with sorrow, understandable sorrow. Sorrow and grief are the reflection of love. The deeper we love, the more we hurt sometimes. And it clouds our ability to be spiritually connected and witness what's really happening. I hadn't been with a soul when they transitioned for a few years after I quit seeing patients in the ER until I was sitting with my mother-in-law as she was approaching her transition. And she'd been very awake and alert and everything right up until just hours before it was time for her to go. And she had said many times she wanted her husband to come get her. I knew her husband very well for many years, for decades. He'd only passed a few years before, and he was just this wonderful, honest, hardworking man filled with love and just the kind of soul you like to be and the kind of soul you like to be around. And she was looking forward to seeing him again. And I was there when she took her last breath, and I witnessed her husband come and get her. Sometimes when I have a lot of clients that think they've never had a spiritual experience. And one of the things I often suggest to them, if you want a spiritual experience, go volunteer with hospice. You don't have to have any medical training. They'll give you some training about, what to expect and how to deal with it and things. I've never known anybody that worked in hospice that didn't have profound spiritual experiences. Have any of you ever heard of Chris Kerr? It's K-R-I-S, last name is K-E-R-R. I think that's the spelling. Chris Kerr is a hospice physician, works up in the New England area. I'll be speaking with him next month at an event. He has done research for quite some time now on what he calls end-of-life visions and dreams. And he's published some papers. You can read his medical papers published in journals. People, as they approach the end of life, they start to have experiences. And the experiences are usually involved feeling like somebody's coming to prepare them. They're usually pleasant experiences. They usually increase in frequency as a person gets closer to passing. And there's some other characteristics about them. If you want to watch a really great TED Talk, look up Chris Kerr and watch his TED Talk. Our problem is we think that birth and death are separate things and that they come in order, and you're born first and then you die. But if we really could see it from a broader perspective, we would realize that birth and death are actually the same thing viewed from opposite perspectives. So we welcome children into this world with great rejoicing and awe and wonder. And we don't see the souls on the other side of the veil that are weeping because they're going to be separated for a time. And they're comforting one another and reassuring one another. It's okay. They're on their path. This is right. We'll see them again. But when it comes to death, we view it from the opposite perspective. We're standing around comforting one another, promising each other, it's okay, we'll see them again. This is part of their path. And we don't see the souls on the other side of the veil rejoicing and welcoming them home. Birth and death are the same thing, just flipped over. And if we view it properly, we'd realize that actually birth doesn't come first. Death always comes first. Birth and death always come together, and death comes first. We experience a spiritual death, if you will, a spiritual demise when we enter this world. We don't see things as well. We don't move around as well as we did when we were outside the flesh. We are separated from loved ones. It's very literally a death, if you will, that prepares us and enables us to be born into this existence. And if you believe in the Jewish mikveh or the Christian baptism or some other religious traditions, many of them have ablution ceremonies. Muslims have an ablution ceremony. It's about birth and death, and the death comes first. I mean, it's explicitly stated in the Christian baptism in the New Testament that you die, you have a spiritual death that's represented in baptism, you're buried in the water, and then you come forth again to a newness of life. The death comes first and then the rebirth. And when we die physically, it's to put us in a position to be able to be spiritually born again in our next existence. So birth and death are profoundly spiritual. And I encourage and invite you that if you can push aside the grief a little bit and just stop and pause and say, oh, this is a profound experience. Someone is graduating to the next realm here. Sometimes you will join them in this experience. So a lot of people know about near-death experiences when people have a catastrophic injury or a life-threatening illness, and they claim to leave their body and experience a divine place before they come back, like the one I told you earlier with Jeff Olson. But there's also what's called a shared death experience, which is what I had. I was near Jeff Olson. I wasn't dying. I was in perfect health. I didn't have any medical problems. I wasn't on any medications, anything like that. And yet I got to go part of the journey there on the other side of the veil with him, if you will. That's called a shared death experience. Some of you may be aware of a man called William Peters. He's a friend of mine. He just published a book less than a year ago about shared death experiences, and he's been talking about that a lot. And many people who have had a loved one pass have had a shared death experience. Sometimes they don't realize it, but they're actually very common. So I said earlier, it's good to not just depend on what you can see and what you can hear, but also pay attention to what you feel and what you know. And let me give you an example of that. I had a client just a couple of weeks ago. Her son had passed. I asked her, I said, have you had any experiences with your son since he passed? She said, no, none at all. And then she kind of hesitated and she goes, well, I didn't see him, but I knew he was there. See, this is one of the big hurdles for spiritual experiences is you have to stop diminishing them by stating what they're not. I didn't see him. And so once you say that, you diminish everything that happens afterwards. So she said, I didn't see him, but I knew he was there. Well, I've been down this road a few times with clients, so I had an idea where we were going. I asked her, I said, so after your son, after you had that experience where he was close, did you have any feelings about it? Was he okay? Oh yeah. Yeah, he's very happy. He's in a good place. I know that. I said, well, did you feel his love? Oh yes. I felt it was incredible. I could feel his love. That's how I knew it was him. I said, was it comforting? Yes, it was very comforting. And I told my client, I said, okay, listen, next time you describe this experience, try saying it like this. Rather than saying, I didn't see anything and I didn't get a message, which is what another thing she told me. I said, rather than saying that, try saying it this way. My son loved me so much, he came to me and I felt his presence and he communicated his love for me and that he was okay, that he was happy, and he comforted me. And the woman just started to weep because she finally understood. She got the message. There wasn't the words. She got the message without the words. They communicate in a way that's so much more efficient and so much more thorough and expansive than just the words or even what we see. It's about what you feel and what you know. And so I often encourage my clients when they've had a spiritual experience to write it down and to write it in great detail. And most of the time when they're writing that detail about their spiritual experience, they'll start to notice more detail than they had appreciated the first time. They'll start to see more than they saw the first time. And I encourage them always write, include in this what you felt and what you knew, even if you couldn't explain how you knew it, because that is usually much more of the message. So I continue to get these experiences, even now that I've stopped seeing patients. When I first started talking about my book, people would want to have these long conversations about my book. And I soon realized that during the conversations, I was getting downloads of things I should say to these people. And they weren't things that I would normally say. And sometimes I understood that they were messages from a deceased loved one, one of my clients' deceased loved ones. They were early clients back then. They were just friends because I wasn't really doing it in any kind of a formal way. I was just having lunch with my friends talking about my book. But I was sharing this with a friend one day and he looked at me and he goes, I think you're a healer. I said, no. Homie, don't do no healing. I didn't even think of myself as a healer when I was in the emergency department. I was just a doctor helping people with their physical ailments. I said, no, I'm not a healer. In fact, because as I told you earlier, I felt like I grew up in a Christian tradition. I even corrected him and said, hey, there's only one healer. That was what I believed. And he said something very strange. He said, I think you're a healer. He said, I disagree with you. I think you're a healer and I think you should ask for permission to use the word, which I thought was a very unusual thing for somebody to say. So I came home, I changed my clothes, I went out for a run because often I get good communication when I'm running. And while I was out running on this beautiful day, I said, is it okay to call myself a healer? And a divine being that I believe was Christ came to me and he chuckled and he said, of course, I made you a healer. And with those few words, I got this huge flow of understanding and I understood, oh, he's not jealous. He's not insecure. If I'm a really good healer, it doesn't make him less. And I came home that day. That was the day I put healer on my website and on my business card. We're all healers in some way or another. If we step into it, if we encourage, if we lift and strengthen, if we give comfort, if we kick somebody in the pants when they need it. There's ways of helping people along. It's like Rumi said, we're all just helping one another home. And that way we're all healers. See, we shy away from certain words because they have too much context. They're too loaded. with people's assumptions, which is why it's so hard for people like me to talk about their experiences. I didn't talk about my experiences for 25 years. And it's only talking about them in the last few years that's enabled me to be able to feel more comfortable talking about it. I was very reluctant to share, very resisting it very much. And some of my friends were pushing me pretty hard to share more. And I remember one day I could hear my own timid voice say, but what if my message isn't good enough? And then the voice that's been speaking to me since I was a kid said, it's not your message, which was a big ego check for me. It kind of, oh, and a couple of weeks later, Spirit woke me up in the middle of the night and I couldn't go back to sleep. I tried for an hour or two to get back to sleep. And when I couldn't get back to sleep, I finally asked, I said, why did you wake me up? And the voice said, I've been giving you messages. Why aren't you sharing them? You know, a messenger came to me one morning and said, every experience is to enable you to help someone else. I said, wait a minute. I thought, I argue with my voices a lot. When I have my own notions and they're not easy, I'm not easily disabused of them. And I said, I thought experiences were for personal growth. And the voice said, the primary purpose of every experience is to enable you to help someone else. You get the secondary benefit of personal growth. There's a 180-degree flip in what my understanding of why I'm here. Most of my experiences are to give me empathy to be able to help others. And many of those experiences can't help anybody if I'm not willing to share them. Some of my experiences are for me, and most of them are for me to share, or at least to learn from, so that I can go help others. So I used to tell people, they'd ask me, you know, how to have a spiritual experience. And I'd say, if you really want a spiritual experience, do this one simple little thing. In the morning, when you get connected, whether you pray or meditate or ponder, whatever you do to get centered in the morning, ask this question: what can I do today to serve someone else? And I promise you, if you ask that question, you will have a spiritual experience. You might not realize it's a spiritual experience, but you will get an inclination. You will get an intuition, a feeling. Oh, I need to reach out and tell somebody that that I love them. I need to just tell somebody I'm thinking about them. I need to go run this errand for somebody. I need to help somebody this. You'll get an impression. And if you write it down, all the better. And then if you go do it, all the better still. And the next time you ask that question, your answer will come just a little bit easier and a little bit quicker and a little bit clearer. And things will become more clear to you. You'll see, one of the challenges with learning to walk in a guided life is people think that spiritual gifts just come upon us whole souled and perfect and ready to be exercised. But they don't. They come like a musical gift. You can have a profound musical gift, but unless you practice your instrument for 40,000 hours, you won't become proficient enough to share it. You won't play in Carnegie Hall. You have to work on it every day. You can have an athletic gift, but if you don't show up every day to practice, you don't take the field with the team. It's not enough to have a gift, and your gift isn't enough. Is not perfect. You have to perfect it. The same's true with spiritual gifts. If you want to hear the voice, you have to practice hearing the voice, and you have to be obedient. And it's a trial and error thing sometimes. And sometimes it's really hard. I remember I was talking one time in a group and somebody raised their hand and said, well, do you ask that question every day? I said, oh, no. They said, why not? I said, well, some days I don't want to know. Some days I want to myself, and I don't want to be sent on an errand to help somebody else. So I offered that with this caveat. Some of you are servers, and you serve others to your own detriment. Don't do that. You have to feed your own vessel if you're going to consistently help others. So ask instead, what should I do today? What can I do today? What is my errand today? I remember one time I asked, what should I do today? And the voice said, enjoy this day which I have given you. It wasn't about serving anybody else at all. It was about self-care. So if you're one of those people that goes out and serves everybody to your own exhaustion and detriment, modify the question and take care of yourself so that you can do what you need to do as well. So usually when I work with clients, I work from the assumption that they already have their answers. You already have what you need inside of you. All I do with my clients is sometimes I help them to recognize the experience for themselves. So let me give you an example. A woman came to me who's was in, I think, in her mid 40s. And she told me right up front, she had 4 children. 2 of them had an incurable progressive neurologic disorder that eventually would take their lives. And she told me right flat out when we first met, my biggest problem is I don't trust God and I feel like he's abandoned me. She grew up in a very Catholic tradition. And so she used the typical male pronouns with regards to God and those kind of words. And as we visited further, we're about an hour into the conversation, and she proceeds to tell me about this childhood experience. She had a rough childhood. Her home was not good. She spent a lot of time at her grandparents' house. And one night she woke up in the middle of the night in a heavy rainstorm, and she got out of bed and walked down the hallway. And the way she described it to me, it sounded like there was a whole wall of windows looking into the backyard. And she looked out through the windows, and in the backyard, she saw this beautiful, glorious being that she said was Christ, surrounded by 5 small children. And even though she was in the house observing him outside at a distance, she said it felt like he was standing right next to her, leaning toward her ear, and he whispered in her ear, "Don't be afraid of the storm. I will never leave you." And after this woman shared this incredible experience with me, she started talking about something else entirely, went off in a different direction. And I stopped her. I says, whoa, 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 wait a minute. And Spirit spoke to me. And I said to her, did you have another child you didn't tell me about? And she acknowledged that she'd had a miscarriage, I believe it was, or she'd lost the child at birth. And I said, you realize the 5 children you saw surrounding Christ were yours, right? She had never thought of it that way. It hadn't occurred to her. She hadn't connected the dots because she was so in it that she couldn't get the perspective of viewing it from an objective position. And I said, God didn't forsake you. He didn't leave you alone. God loved you so much, he came 30 years in advance to tell you not to be afraid of the storm, that he'd always be there. You see, we have experiences all the time, most of us, and we just sometimes don't realize how profound they are, how meaningful and special and unique they are. And our society so much tamps us down about talking about them that we kind of don't share them with others, when what we should be doing is we should be gathering and sharing our experiences in such a way as to strengthen each other, to validate one another. So, trying to decide which direction to go here. I remember one time in the emergency department, I walked in and my colleague was trying to resuscitate a woman drowned in a hotel pool. And I looked up at the cardiac monitor, and she didn't have a cardiac rhythm, and they were doing chest compressions. And I became aware of this soul outside of her body, and she was like just getting her bearings and starting to recognize what it felt like to not be in her physical form, and just kind of getting her feet on the floor, if you will, although she wasn't on the floor, of course. And then all of a sudden she was gone. And I remember thinking, whoa, wait a minute, where did she go? What happened? And then I looked at her cardiac monitor and she had a heartbeat again. She wasn't gone at all. She was just back in her body. I think that happens a lot more than we appreciate. My friend Pim van Lommel is a cardiologist in the Netherlands. He did a big trial, multi-center trial of people who suffer cardiac arrest and then are successfully resuscitated. And he published his results in the Lancet, arguably the most reputable medical journal in the world. And he showed that 19 point something percent, just shy of 20% of people that survive a cardiac arrest that are resuscitated have an out-of-body or near-death experience. Other studies indicate that it might be much higher in the intensive care unit with people that have suffered catastrophic trauma or illness, might be as high as 30%. And in fact, one big survey suggested that between 4 and 5% of the general population have had an experience. So it happens a lot. One of my friends was an emergency nurse up in Pennsylvania, and she had a patient come in. He was a man, and he was Amish or Mennonite, I believe. And he was in the midst of a cardiac arrest, and she was literally doing chest compressions. She was pumping on his chest when she looked up and saw him standing in the corner of the room observing his own resuscitation. Well, she and the rest of the team successfully crammed his spirit or his soul back into his physical body and sent him up to the ICU. And then a few days later, she went up to visit him. And this man, as I said, was in a very strict religious tradition, and he was of German descent, and he had a very black and white way of looking at the world in many regards, and particularly religion. And he said when he left his body, he met a being that he said was Christ, and he had protested in front of this divine soul that he had read all the books, that he had done everything he was told to do, he had kept all the rules. And this divine being looked at him and said, it wasn't about the rules, it was about love. And then sent him back to share that message. And he came back and he shared the message with my friend, the nurse, and others. Every chance he got, he shared it with her every time he saw her for several years until he finally passed away. We get caught up in the things that don't matter. And this is part of what I was talking about earlier when I said, when I experienced Tamara, that's Jeff's deceased wife's name, Tamara. They were married for 10 years before the accident. When I said that in her presence, all the priorities reprioritized, and love always floats to the top. Love is always at the top of everything. And we tend to forget that sometimes because we get so caught up in the things of the world. We get so caught up in the mundane, in the physical, in the money, in the health, and judging ourselves against everybody else. When Jeff Olson had his out-of-body experience, he was given an opportunity to hold his 14-month-old son that had died in the accident. His name's Griffin. And it's interesting the way he describes the experience, because he said that it was so physical. It felt so physical, even though he knew it was spiritual. He could feel his son's breath against his neck. He could smell his son, as any parent that's held a baby can appreciate. and he could feel his chest move when he took a breath. And as he's holding his son, having this experience, he sensed the presence of a divine being approaching him from behind that he knew was the divine. And it was a masculine presence that wrapped his arms around Jeff and the baby and held them both. So as he held his son, he was being held by his divine father, if you will. And he said at the moment he wondered about things he'd done in his life that he viewed to be wrong or sinful. Sometimes he'd done things that were just wrong, and sometimes he'd done things he knew were wrong and did them anyway. And he wondered if he could ever be forgiven. And this divine being said, there's nothing to forgive. That's not how we view things here. Everything is in divine order. And Jeff and I speak together a lot, and that often gets shared. And then during the Q&A, it's not at all uncommon for somebody to throw their hand in the air, and they're really troubled that some NDE, near-death experiencers, don't describe this horrific judgment. And they say, well, what about Hitler? That's where it always goes. That's the question. What about Hitler? And that bothered me for a while. And then one day, somebody asked that question, and I had an aha moment, and I felt like Spirit spoke to me and said, their question has nothing to do with Hitler. Their question is all about themselves. What they're really asking is, how bad does someone have to be before it's okay for me not to love them? I know we're supposed to love everyone, but surely not them, right? How bad does somebody have to be before it's okay for me to not love them? We too often look for judgment and ways not to love people instead of forgiveness and ways to love them. And if there's one lesson, you ask, I think, any near-death experiencer what the overarching lesson that they gained from their experience, and not just near-death experiencers, shared death experiencers like myself, and other people that communicate with the divine or their higher self or angels, they'll all say the unequivocal, overarching, most important thing is love. How do we love more? In fact, the only question Jeff Olson was asked during his interview was, to what degree did you learn to love? Thank you, everybody, for having me. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I wish you all the very best.